Military pilot training in Tucson. Is it helping with pilot shortages? Wrapping up the loose ends before Tuesday's primary election, Latinos close the digital divide, and what's happening to the trees in the Rillito. This is Metro Week. It's hard to miss Davis-Monthan Air Force Base with all the military planes in the sky. There's another military operation in town, and it's struggling to meet staffing needs. We'll find out why, but first, a look at the week's top stories.
Good news for those who want to get from Tucson to Hermosillo, Mexico without driving to the Phoenix airport or making the long 6-hour drive. Edomar Airlines will begin direct service from Tucson to the Sonoran capital starting in October. Tucson has not had a direct flight to Hermosillo since 2008, when Aeromexico pulled out of the Tucson International Airport. The Edomar 68-seat prop planes will be doing limited runs, then expand, depending on the demand. The flights will take a little more than an hour and are expected to cost around $350. Want to get your finances in shape? Well, a free financial boot camp is being held this weekend. The focus is on budgeting skills, credit repair, and debt management. 2 local nonprofits are joining forces to offer the 3-hour boot camp this Saturday. Registration information is on our website. If you plan to attend, be prepared to bring your financial records to get some organizational help. And in celebration of its 100th year anniversary, this is the last weekend to get in free to any of America's 412 national parks. Of course, one of the most beautiful parks in the country is right here in southern Arizona, Saguaro National Park. The Park Service has been trying to attract people who haven't visited the nation's parks, especially young people. For more on these and other stories, visit news.azpm.org.
The U.S. Air Force is experiencing a shortage of fighter pilots. That puts extra emphasis on the work of the Tucson-based 162nd Wing of the Arizona Air National Guard, which trains about 10% of the Air Force's new fighter pilots each year. The shortage makes it difficult to keep the 162nd at full staff. Zach Ziegler reports.
The sight of military jets flying over town is nothing new for Tucsonans. And while some are familiar with the saga of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base's A-10s, the less public work with the F-16 is also an important part of military operations in town. The Arizona Air National Guard's 162nd Fighter Wing flies and maintains about 80 of the fighter jets out of Tucson International Airport. And a large part of their operation is training 25 U.S. pilots a year.
After basic pilot training where you've earned your wings, you now come out to one of our units and you earn your rating in the unit's airplane.
Lieutenant Colonel Coatney serves as both a trainer and an administrator for the 162nd. He says the pilot shortage hasn't had an effect on the teaching part of his job, but
from a manning standpoint, much has changed. There's less of a pool to recruit from. The airlines are a big draw.
The thing that makes that part of his job the toughest is competition from commercial airlines.
We're experienced, disciplined aviators and ripe for the picking for our airline counterparts. So my pool to recruit talent from is dwindling.
And replacing a pilot once he leaves military service is not a quick process.
To be a pilot, you have to be an officer, which requires a 4-year degree. Pilot training is about a year to year and a half. And then the F-16 training here is about 9 months to a year. So that's 6 to 7 years before you actually get to be a combat-ready wingman and a fighter.
He says the experience of flying a fighter jet makes up for the years it takes to learn the skill.
You don't see any airplane behind you, you just see all the world in front of you. So it's kind of feel like you're just flying around in space there.
He's nearing the end of his time training with the 162nd, but he's open to coming back.
I have about 6 years left on that commitment, so we've got 2 or 3 assignments in me, and then we'll kind of see where things go from there. Especially talking to the lifestyle of some of these guys here, it's definitely appealing at the end of my career path.
Captain Naldrich J's next stop is Osan Air Base in Korea, and he might see a familiar face from the 162nd there.
We're going to send a couple of our instructors to different bases in Korea and Japan to integrate with those squadrons and get our name out there, because if there's a pilot in those units that are looking to potentially go to the airlines, we're going to offer them another course of action. Hey, if you're looking for stability, if you want to get back to the U.S., we want to capture your talent. Why don't you come join the Guard?
Join the Guard, keep flying a fighter jet, and also possibly train the next generation.
And now Zach Ziegler joins me in the studio for more on the Air Force fighter pilot shortage. How bad is it?
The U.S. Air Force is currently down about 500 pilots. Now, that's kind of a hard number to put in context. There hasn't been much said about a definite number. A good estimate that I saw was the Washington Post said typical full force on fighter pilots is around 3,500. So you work that out, it could be 1/7 of the force.
And this is not something that is an easy or quick fix, right?
No, as you heard them talk about, this is up to 6 years of training if you include the fact that they have to be officers, which means they need a 4-year college degree. Captain Aldrich Jays told me that means they're talking a 10-year commitment once they are done with college. So the first time you can really start talking about doing something with your life besides being a pilot is going to be somewhere in your mid-30s. That's quite a commitment, and it's understandable why they want this. Those jets cost at least 8 figures. You really want someone to know what they're doing with this, and you need to be pretty confident in them. Plus, they also can, in a combat situation, have many, many lives in their hands.
How exactly does this affect operations for the National Guard unit here in Tucson?
Well, on one hand, it's a very good thing. You know that there's going to be no change, or at least if there is change, it would probably be growth as far as it comes to their training mission. Now, the other thing that you have to realize is they need people to do that training, and they also have what's called the aerospace control operations out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, more of a securing the homeland role there. And they have to keep F-16 pilots there too, so that could always be a bit of a trick, trying to keep at a full staff at all times between people who are just flying the plane and also people who are training others to fly it.
So the unit at the airport is training, and the unit at Davis-Monthan is full-time
Yes,
workers.
yes, and at any given moment there can be quite a bit of training going on, because it's not just the U.S. Pilots that get trained out at Tucson International Airport.
And U.S. Senator John McCain refers to this National Guard unit, the 162nd in Tucson, as one of the best kept secrets. Why is that?
Well, it's a pretty small base. If you look at, or pretty small wing in comparison to the Air Force Base we're used to talking about here in town. Davis-Monthan has about 6,500 enlisted, 3,000 civilian contractors. If you look at the 162nd, they have fewer than 2,000 people total there. It's notably smaller, so it's a little less of an impact on daily life in Tucson. But when you look at the operations that they do there, they can be very important. As I mentioned, they train pilots from other nations. 27 partner nations in total send their F-16 pilots here to be trained at the 162nd. We also, as we talked about, that kind of aerospace controlled defense role. There's also what's called TFTC, what used to be known as Operation Snowbird, where pilots come down here to train at all times of the year because, as you heard Captain Aldrich Jay said, the air here is quite well suited. There's not a lot of storms, it's nice and shiny all the time. It's a great place to fly out of. And then there's also reconnaissance, unmanned aerial vehicle operations that are run by the 162nd, where they have that out at Davis-Monthan, and also they actually fly the aircraft out of Fort Huachuca.
So there's a few thousand people doing that flying here in Tucson. Most of us then, the rest of us in town, don't fly. What was it like when you went to see this training?
It's definitely an experience. You know, as a reporter, you get to go to some really interesting places. I'd never been that up close to a jet other than in a museum. And so to see these jets that were actually active, and to hear them take off, I have a new definition of loud after sitting next to those. You saw shots in the piece of an airliner coming in for a landing. We also saw some take off. If you just closed your eyes and guessed which one was which, you might get them switched, because an F-16 taking off is actually louder than a passenger jet plane, or at least it's really close.
All right, well, thanks for bringing your reporting to us. The state's primary election is Tuesday, and some races will be decided that day, while others will go on to the November ballot. Here's a look. Some races for offices such as Constable and Justice of the Peace will have only primary elections, because the candidates in some of those races are from one political party. Voters also will decide who advances from the primary in 2 county supervisor seats and the county-wide seats for attorney, sheriff, assessor, and superintendent of schools. If you received an early ballot in the mail but have not mailed it back yet, don't. It must get to the county recorder by the time polls close Tuesday, and the best way to ensure that is to take it to your polling place on Election Day. Dylan Smith joins me now for a quick rundown of the races. Now, we talked about the county races in our setup, but there's also corporation commissioners on the Republican ballot. There are state House and state Senate seats. There's Congress. Have voters time to still make a decision if they haven't already yet? Will candidates be out campaigning this weekend?
I imagine there'll be candidates and activists out trying to knock on doors, especially turn out the vote for those people that they know haven't cast an early ballot. Plenty of ballots have already come in, but certainly there are people like me who wait until Election Day to go to the polls and do it a little bit more old school. But, there's still time for people, if they're unsure about especially some of the down ballot races, to do a little bit more research, to check people out and actually make an informed decision about who they're going to cast a vote for.
Which is always what we hope they're doing in
Indeed.
any case. Now, I want you to evaluate the race in Arizona's 2nd congressional district, which at this point is a primary between 2 Democrats, Matt Hines and Victoria Steele, who we had in for an interview. How is that race going so far?
It's going to be interesting to see who Democrats vote for in this primary. Certainly, Hines has the fundraising lead on the Democratic side in the primary over Steele, although Steele is, in many ways, has a little bit more name recognition, having been more recently active in local politics. Hines was off being a bit of a bureaucrat for a while, working on the Affordable Care Act and its implementation. So they both are pretty good candidates. I don't know if they're good enough candidates, either of them, when the general election rolls around, to take out the incumbent, Martha McSally, who has a vast fundraising lead.
I want to touch a little bit on the Republican primary in the 1st congressional district. You brought that district up. Ann Kirkpatrick, who's running for Senate, vacated, or it's an open seat because of that. So there are, I think, 5 Republicans left in the race at this point. David Gowan, the former Speaker of the House, he dropped out and he endorsed Gary Keeney, who's a rancher. And they've kind of formed this anti-Paul Babu, who's the Pinal County Sheriff, contingent in that race. Do you think that it's going to matter to voters that Gowan endorsed Keeney in this really crowded race? How much does that matter?
Babu has had, been leading in the polls, has, I think, the most name recognition of any candidate there. It is such a large district, extending from the Utah border and the Grand Canyon all the way down to the Tucson suburbs. And mostly when people across the country refer to it, they call it the Flagstaff congressional seat. So to have somebody from southern Arizona, basically, representing that district is a little bit odd. It would have been even odder with Gowan, who doesn't even live in the district, who lives much closer to the Mexican border even. Really, all of the candidates in that have not, they're splitting the I don't want to vote for Babu vote. So he may well come out on top just because of that, because everybody else has been running against him and not making the best case for themselves.
Thanks, Dylan. Latinos appear to be closing the long-standing digital divide. A Pew Center report says that since 2009, Latino Internet use has risen 25 percentage points. Nancy Montoya takes a look at what's happening close to home.
For 2-year-old Penelope, getting online to play a game on her mom's cell phone is, well, no big deal. While Hispanic, she is also bilingual, moving easily between 2 languages. By the time she gets to kindergarten, she will be somewhat literate in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and digital. That last one, digital, has been a major concern for America's Latino community, creating a digital divide which in many cases translates into slower achievement rates in school. But great progress is being made, and not just among Latino children, also among their parents and grandparents. In 2009, Latino adults using the internet were stagnant at around 51%, compared to 80% in the white community. But recently, a national study conducted by the Pew Research Center found that percentage has shot up more than 25 points to 78%. Internet use in the white community also grew, but much slower, from 80 to 89%. What's driving the sharp increase? Not as you might think, American-born Latinos or those who have been in this country for years. Instead, the driving force are 2 groups: immigrant Latinos and Spanish-dominant Hispanics. And their device of choice? Their cell phone. Smartphones have made it easier and cheaper for users to get online and use it like a laptop or a desktop computer.
Joining me in the studio for more is Nancy Montoya. Let's get more into what is the digital divide. What does that mean?
Well, the digital divide used to be described as does your house, your home, have broadband connection? And it used to be the more minority communities you had, the poorer communities you had, the greater the digital divide. It was also in our classrooms. If you had fewer accesses to computers and to high tech, the digital divide was greater. But today, the digital divide really means, do you have access to the internet?
Anywhere.
Anywhere.
Okay.
And so now we're looking at it in a whole new way. Now the digital divide is really, as I said in the piece, it's starting to narrow more and more. Not because broadband connections have gone up in homes. In fact, it's stayed pretty stable, but because cell phones have gotten better, have gotten cheaper in many cases, and they've gone to smartphones where anyone can get online almost anywhere.
So what does that look like in Tucson specifically, that digital divide?
It's looking good. It's looking good. Although they cannot measure it throughout the entire county, which is Pima County. I talked with the superintendent of public schools, and they said they've had about a 10% increase in narrowing the digital divide, if that makes sense.
However, the difference has been narrowed.
Right,
by
the
10%.
difference has
Got
been
it.
narrowed by about 10%. One of the school districts, though, that is making leaps and bounds kind of advances in the digital divide is Sunnyside School District. And that's because 7 years ago, they started giving out laptops to their students. And unlike many of the other school districts where you had access to the laptop and you used it at home, I think, Vail, you did a story on that not too long ago.
In Tucson too, both
Right.
of those.
Sunnyside says, okay, this is your laptop. You take it home. And the other thing we want you to do is we want you to teach your mom and your dad and your grandparents how to use it. The other thing that's very interesting is that in Sunnyside, the whole idea of broadband connection has expanded. They have worked partnerships with some of the big cable companies. And so their broadband connection in homes over the past 4 years has gone from 61% all the way up to 80%. So these kids actually have broadband connection at home as well.
So what about the difference between English speakers, Spanish speakers, and bilingual speakers in Tucson?
Well, you know, you might think that the longer you've been in the U.S., or if you were native born here, that you would be using your cell phone more and more and more. But the opposite is true. If you were a recent immigrant from a Latin American country, or if you are primarily Spanish speaking, the chances that you're going to use your cell phone more have gone up. And this is where we're seeing the big increase. It's not in US born Hispanics, it's in recent immigrants coming to this country. And if you just look at Mexico right now, the homes, only 35 to 40% have actual broadband connections in their homes, what they do is they've got a lot of hot spots all over their community, right? And they utilize their cell phones all the time. So it really stands to reason that if you're accustomed to using it in Mexico or in any Latin American country, when you come to the U.S., you're going to use it a lot too.
Thank you so much for your reporting on this.
My pleasure.
The metro area river parks are popular places for outdoor recreation. That's why some Tucsonans were concerned when they saw vegetation being removed from the Rillito riverbed to help improve the water flow. Tony Paniagua takes us there.
Over here. I mean, they totally scraped this. There used to be, you know, the little seedlings.
Dan Duncan and Marcela Vasquez Leon have lived along the Rillito River Park for years, and they say they have never seen anything like this. The riverbed has become a flurry of activity they were not expecting, especially of this magnitude. Workers are using heavy machinery to remove much of the vegetation used by local birds and other wildlife. Stretches of habitat and their animals, which the couple used to enjoy, are disappearing right before their eyes.
You can see the whole wash from bank to bank has been scraped. It's like a bombscape. And I really question why.
I left for the summer, and when I came back, I found no vegetation. I hear this at 6:30 in the morning, every morning. It's been like this for the past 2 months. So it's not only annoying, but it is a destruction of an area that has been maintained and protected for a long time. And I should emphasize that Pima County has been a leader in created protected areas, in protecting natural habitats in water courses. So all these completely contradicts what Pima County has been doing, and I was very surprised. I trust Pima County because they've done a great job. That's why we love Tucson.
I understand that there's need for flood control, even though not too long ago, within the last decade, we went through a 500-year flood. And we didn't get flooded. The county did a very effective job at riprapping both sides. And this part of the Rillito has actually been pretty safe. So how many times in the next couple of decades are we going to have 500-year floods? They could have done it differently. They could have channeled the middle part of it, I believe, and left the outer edges green.
Every day I walk my dog every afternoon. So I have always really enjoyed walking down the Rillito and seeing the birds. When it rains, you hear the frogs. So it's a great place to just walk around. But now it's like if the whole entire place had been bombed. There is no vegetation, it feels completely different, and it is very sad.
Residents say it's also pitiful west of here, where the Columbus Weed Patch, a popular place for birders and other naturalists, was also demolished.
Unfortunately, we found out after that had happened, and we were really dismayed. It was an instance where, agencies not communicating with one another. My understanding is that they were trying to save taxpayer dollars by not having to truck that debris to a farther site. However, I think what's sometimes unquantifiable is, what do we lose in terms of tourism dollars that are spent in our community based on an activity like birding? And that's very difficult to quantify.
Moving forward, Tucson Audubon and neighborhood residents are hoping scenes like these can be prevented or mitigated with better communication, cooperation, and planning.
Joining me now is Suzanne Shields, the director of the Regional Flood Control District in Pima County. Thanks for coming in, and let's just start at the beginning. What is this project?
This project is a major maintenance project on the Rillito River. We're doing sediment removal. The construction of the channel was done in 1996 by the Corps of Engineers. And as a local sponsor, we're responsible for maintaining the flood carrying capacity in the channel. After the 2006 flood event that we had on the Rillito, a lot of the upper watershed, a lot of the sediment became loose. And we've been monitoring it as it's kind of flowed back down into the valley, into this area of the Rillito River from essentially Swan to Craycroft. And what we found in 2015, we did some topographic mapping, and then we remodeled the 100-year floodplain. And we found that if we don't remove the sediment, what will happen is that if there was a 100-year flood, there would be overbank flooding of homes and residents in the area.
So the sediment's taking up some of the space that you wish water to be flowing in a flood.
Yes. And so we went through and discussed it with the U.S. Corps of Engineers and came up with a plan. And so about 2 months ago, we started excavating in the channel to remove the sediment. And unfortunately, you can't remove the sediment without removing the vegetation that's growing on it. So we've been in the process of clearing out the channel so it can flow, so it's safe for the public, safe for our bridges, and of course safe for the residential structures along the river.
So we heard from people who were concerned about specifically the vegetation removal. Nobody seemed that concerned about the sediment removal, but because those are habitats for animals, the trees, the bushes, people who walk there every day, I'm sure, are very familiar with the animals that live there. So the concern was, are we removing habitat for animals? And so I'd like you to respond.
Well, part of it, it's kind of a temporary impact, if you will. If you actually saw that whole river in 1996 after it was constructed, there wasn't any vegetation. It was just a simple sand bottom, you know, from one side of the bank to the other. And so the vegetation will grow back. And we're trying not to remove vegetation any place that we don't have to. So we're trying to limit it, but this was one area that was of significant concern. We will let vegetation grow back in. There is one area that we're going to be doing some grading for stormwater harvesting, if you will, and put out some seeding and some plants, in part to make sure that we establish native vegetation and not invasive species.
How did you decide where in the river to do it? Or, for example, that it was that section of the Rillito as opposed to some of the Pantano or Santa Cruz? How did you come to that point?
In 2015, what we actually do, and we do this about every 5 years, is we flew aerial topography on all the rivers. And so we actually have these models that we use the existing ground data, and then we run the models to see what happens with the flows. 50-year flow, 100-year flow, those types of larger storm events. And when we redid the Rillito, this was an area of some significant concern. It wasn't just a little bit of water coming out. It was whole neighborhoods that could be impacted. So that raised it to an area that we really felt we need to focus our maintenance attention and clear out the sediment.
Any sense of how deep that sediment is, how many feet you're removing?
It varied across the channel, but there were areas that it was 5 to 6 feet deep. So it was a significant amount of material to move. Altogether, we've moved about 225,000 cubic yards of material.
And how long will the project last?
It's just winding down, probably about another week to 2 weeks, and then we'll be clear and out of the channel.
Did you contact neighbors, or we actually heard from the Audubon Society was a little concerned about not being contacted before this started. So what was the process?
Well, there was some confusion. We did put out some press releases, and we have done some interviews. We contacted all the HOAs in and around the area and put out information to the neighborhoods. We tried to put out signs of what we were doing, but a lot of times they get vandalized or just removed. In the one particular area that we're going to be revegetating, it apparently was an area that the Audubon Society uses for bird watching, but we were not aware of it. We had looked at the area, it was called the weed patch, and to us that's what it looked like. We actually did contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and got clearance for this work that we're doing. So we are sensitive to, the environmental issues, but we were not aware that this was a birding area.
What about downstream? I mean, will water be moving faster when there's not vegetation stopping it? Will there be any downstream impacts?
No, there really should not be any downstream impacts. The whole river system has some grade controls that help slow and check the flow as it goes downstream.
All right, thanks for coming in and telling us about it. That's it for us. Next week, we'll recap the primary election and preview a city council debate about bus fares. Thanks for watching.